The council hall of the Black Ridge Pack was packed wall to wall, every seat filled, every aisle crammed with wolves who had come not for justice, but for spectacle. The scent of cedar smoke hung heavy in the air, and torchlight threw sharp, shifting shadows across the stone walls. At the center of the hall, standing alone on the judgment platform with her wrists bound in iron chains that burned against her skin, was Sapphira. She was 24 years old. She had no title, no rank, no powerful bloodline to shield her. She was the daughter of a dead Omega and a father who had vanished before her first shift, and she had spent her entire life within the borders of Blackridge, surviving on the mercy of wolves who had none. And now they were going to exile her. Alpha Rendell sat on the raised dais at the front of the hall, his thick arms crossed over his chest, his expression carved from granite. His mate, the Luna Direxia, sat beside him in a chair that gleamed with gold leaf, her long auburn hair cascading over one shoulder, her lips curved into a smile she was barely trying to hide. This was Direxia's doing, all of it. Sapphira, of no house and no line, Rendell's voice boomed across the hall. You have been brought before this council on the charge of mating betrayal. You were pledged to Walden, son of my beta. You were given the honor of a match far above your station, and instead of accepting that gift with gratitude, you threw it away. He leaned forward. You chose a stranger, a drifter, a man with no pack, no name, and no wolf anyone in this territory has ever scented. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Sapphira could feel every pair of eyes on her like needles pressing into her skin. Her jaw was tight, her hands were trembling, but she locked them into fists so no one could see. I was never pledged to Walden, she said, and her voice carried, clear and calm, even though her heart was hammering so hard she could feel it in her teeth. I never agreed to that arrangement. Direxia made it without asking me. A gasp went through the crowd, not at the accusation, but at the audacity of an Omega speaking the Luna's name without title. Direxia uncrossed her legs and leaned forward. You forget yourself, little wolf. Her voice was silk wrapped around a blade. I gave you every chance. I brought you into the pack house. I found you a suitable mate. I treated you like a sister. She placed one hand over her heart, and the performance was flawless. And this is how you repay me? By running off with some vagrant who wandered into our territory, smelling like road dust and poverty? Sapphira's chest tightened. She wanted to scream. She wanted to tell every wolf in this hall what Direxia had really done. The years of quiet cruelty, the sabotaged meals, the whispered rumors that kept Sapphira isolated from every wolf who might have been a friend. The way Direxia had arranged the match with Walden, not as a kindness, but as a leash. Because Walden was loyal to Direxia above all others, and a mated Sapphira under Walden's control was a Sapphira who could never leave. But no one would believe her. They never did. The charge stands, Rendell said. Unless the stranger you chose presents himself before this council and proves his worth, you will be stripped of pack membership and exiled beyond the border by dawn. Sapphira's blood ran cold. Tarek. She had met him 6 weeks ago, at the river crossing where the territory ended and the unclaimed wilderness began. She had been washing clothes, Omega work, always Omega work, and he had appeared on the opposite bank like something out of a dream. Tall, broad-shouldered, a jaw that looked like it had been cut from mountain stone, dark hair that fell across his forehead in a way that softened the sheer intensity of his face, and his eyes, amber gold, deep and steady, the kind of eyes that looked at you and saw everything you had ever tried to hide. He had been wearing a plain wool coat, frayed at the cuffs, no pack insignia, no scent of territory, just earth and pine and something warm beneath it, something that had made Sapphira's wolf stir for the first time in years, pressing against her ribs like a second heartbeat. "You're going to cut your hands on those rocks," he had said, nodding toward the rough stones she was scrubbing against. "There's a smoother shelf about 10 paces upstream." She had stared at him. No wolf, no one, had ever spoken to her with that kind of easy, unpossessive concern. Not in Blackridge, not ever. They had talked for 2 hours that first day, and then every day after. Tarek came to the river crossing at the same time each afternoon, always on foot, always in the same worn coat, and they talked about everything and nothing. He asked her questions no one had ever asked, what she dreamed about, what song she hummed when she thought no one was listening, what the sky looked like from the hill behind the pack house at sunset. He listened the way starving people eat, completely, desperately, as if her words were sustenance. She didn't know what pack he came from. He deflected those questions with a quiet skill she hadn't noticed at first. She didn't know his surname, his rank, or his bloodline. She knew only that when he looked at her, she felt real. She felt seen. She felt like someone worth seeing. And then, Direxia had found out. The Luna had spies everywhere. Kitchen wolves, border sentries, even the old healer who Sapphira had once trusted with a childhood secret. Within hours of Direxia learning about the stranger at the river, the machinery of punishment had begun grinding. The charge of mating betrayal was invented. Sapphira had never been formally pledged to Walden, and everyone who mattered knew it. But Direxia had witnesses. Coached, rehearsed, terrified witnesses who would say whatever the Luna told them to say. And now, Sapphira stood in chains. "He'll come," she whispered, more to herself than to the hall. "Give me until morning. He'll come." Direxia laughed. It was a delicate sound, perfectly pitched for sympathy. "Listen to her. She actually believes her little drifter is going to walk into this hall and save her." She turned to Rendell with wide, sorrowful eyes. "It's almost sad, isn't it?" The crowd murmured in agreement. Sapphira could hear the contempt in their voices, the second-hand embarrassment, the eager cruelty of people who had decided she was guilty before she ever opened her mouth. 1 hour. Rendell gave her 1 hour. Sapphira stood on the platform with her wrists burning and her wolf howling inside her chest, and she waited. Minutes crawled. The crowd grew restless. Direxia examined her nails. Walden, a thick-necked, dull-eyed wolf with his father's brutish jaw, sat in the second row with his arms crossed, already looking at Sapphira like she was property he intended to reclaim. 40 minutes passed. 50. Direxia was smiling openly now. Rendell was reaching for his gavel, and then the doors blew open. Not swung, not pushed, blew, as if a gust of wind with the force of a freight train had hit them from the outside, and they crashed against the stone walls with a sound that made every wolf in the hall flinch. A man walked in. He was alone. He wore no armor, carried no weapon. His clothes were simple: dark trousers, a plain shirt, a long coat that moved around him like smoke. But his presence was a physical thing. It rolled into the hall ahead of him like a wave, and Sapphira watched as wolf after wolf went rigid. Spines straightened, heads lowered, hands gripped the edges of seats. It was involuntary. It was primal. Because the dominance pouring off this man was unlike anything any of them had ever felt. It was Tarek. But it wasn't the Tarek she knew from the river. The gentleness was gone. The softness in his eyes had been replaced by something vast and terrifying. An authority so absolute it didn't need to announce itself. It simply existed. and everything around it rearranged. He walked down the center aisle without hurrying, and wolves moved out of his way without being asked. His gaze swept the hall once, a general surveying a battlefield, and then it locked onto Sapphira. The moment their eyes met, Sapphira felt something crack open inside her chest. Not pain, warmth, a flood of it, pouring through her veins like molten gold, and her wolf surged forward with a recognition so fierce it nearly brought her to her knees. Mate. He was her mate. She had felt the pull for weeks, had suspected it, had been afraid to name it because naming it made it real, and real things could be taken from her. But now, standing in this hall with iron on her wrists and exile on the table, the bond announced itself like a thunderclap, and there was no more pretending. Tarek stopped at the base of the platform and looked up at her chains. Something shifted in his expression. It was subtle, a tightening of the jaw, a darkening of those amber eyes, but Sapphira saw it, and it terrified her. Not because it was directed at her, because it was directed at everyone else. Who put those chains on her? His voice was quiet. It didn't need to be loud. The hall had gone so silent that the crackle of the torches sounded like gunfire. Rendell stood. He was a big man, 6'4", 240 pounds of muscle and authority. But next to the energy rolling off Tarek, he looked like a boy playing dress-up in his father's chair. "I am Alpha Rendell of Blackridge. You're in my territory, stranger. Identify yourself." Tarek didn't look at him. He was still looking at the chains. "I asked a question. Who put those chains on her?" Rendell's jaw tightened. "She is being judged by pack law. She was pledged to no one." Tarek finally turned his gaze on Rendell, and the Alpha visibly stepped back. One step. Involuntary. Like his body had recognized something his mind was still trying to deny. "I know every detail of what happened here. I know the pledge was fabricated. I know your Luna orchestrated this tribunal to punish a woman whose only crime was refusing to be controlled." Direxia shot to her feet. "How dare you! You have no standing here, no name, no—" "My name is Tarek Valdrin." The name hit the hall like a physical blow. Sapphira didn't understand, not immediately. But she saw the reaction. She saw Rendell's face drain of color. She saw Direxia's mouth fall open and stay there. She saw the beta clutch the arm of his chair as if the floor had tilted beneath him. She saw wolves throughout the hall dropping to their knees, not bowing, dropping, as if their legs had simply stopped supporting them. Because Tarek Valdrin was not a drifter. He was not a vagrant. He was not a poor stranger with no pack and no name. He was the Alpha King of the Northern Dominion, the supreme Alpha whose territory stretched across 7 packs, whose bloodline was the oldest and most powerful in the entire continent, and whose word was not law, but the thing that law was made from. And he had been walking to a river in a worn coat every afternoon for 6 weeks to talk to a girl no one else thought was worth listening to. Tarek stepped onto the platform. He moved with the unhurried certainty of a man who had never in his life been told no, and he reached for the chains on Sapphira's wrists. He didn't look for a key. He didn't ask for one. He simply closed his hands around the iron links and pulled, and the metal shattered like glass, falling to the stone floor in glittering fragments. Sapphira gasped, not from the release, from his touch. The moment his fingers brushed her skin, the mate bond blazed to life between them with a force that made the air shimmer. She could feel it, a golden thread stretching from her heart to his, vibrating with a frequency that resonated in her bones. And she could see it in his face, too. The way his breath caught, the way his pupils blew wide, the way his hand lingered on her wrist as if letting go was physically impossible. "I'm sorry I'm late," he said, and his voice was low, meant only for her. "I wanted to give them the chance to do the right thing. I should have known they wouldn't." "Tarek," her voice broke on his name. "You never told me." "I know." He lifted his hand and brushed a strand of hair from her face with a gentleness that seemed impossible from someone radiating that much power. "Because I needed you to choose me. Not the title, not the territory, me. The man at the river who couldn't stop coming back, because every word you spoke made me feel more alive than I have in years." Sapphira's eyes filled with tears, and for the first time in as long as she could remember, they weren't tears of pain. Tarek turned back to face the hall, and the tenderness vanished from his expression like a curtain dropping. What replaced it was the face of a king who had just found his mate in chains. "Let me make this very simple." He descended the platform steps slowly, his gaze moving from face to face. "This woman is my fated mate, chosen by the moon, bound by blood and bone and something none of you have the capacity to understand. You chained her. You humiliated her. You built a false tribunal to punish her for the crime of being loved." He stopped in front of Rendell's dais. "There will be a reckoning." Rendell's face was gray. "Alpha King, we had no knowledge. The charges were brought through proper channels, I swear to you. The charges were fabricated, and you didn't bother to verify them because the accused was an Omega with no family to protect her." Tarek's voice cut through the excuse like a blade. "That's not ignorance, Rendell. That's complicity." Direxia was gripping the arms of her chair so tightly, her knuckles had turned white. The performance was over. The silk was gone. What remained was a woman realizing that the game she had been playing with a defenseless Omega had just collided with the most powerful wolf on the continent. "I was protecting the pack," she stammered. "The match with Walden was in her best interest. She had no prospects, no rank. I was trying to help her." "You were trying to cage her." Tarek didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "You saw a woman without protection, and you decided she was yours to control. You engineered a match that would keep her silent and compliant. And when she found someone who treated her like a person instead of a possession, you manufactured a crime to destroy her." Direxia opened her mouth. Nothing came out. Now, if you're still here at this point in the story, I already know you care about what happens to Sapphira, and that means a lot. If you could do me one small favor, hit that subscribe button on Laura's Alpha Collections, drop a comment, and tell me what you're thinking. Was Sapphira right to trust Tarek, even though she didn't know who he really was? And do you think Direxia deserves mercy, or has she gone too far? I read every single comment, and your thoughts matter to me. Welcome to Laura's Alpha Collections. I'm so glad you're here. Tarek turned his back on Direxia. It was the most devastating thing he could have done. Not anger, not punishment, but dismissal. As if she had simply stopped being worth his attention. He looked out over the assembled wolves of Blackridge. "I am invoking sovereign right," he said, and every wolf who understood what that meant stopped breathing. "As Alpha King of the Northern Dominion, I am claiming jurisdiction over this pack effective immediately. Alpha Rendell, you are relieved of command. Luna Direxia, you are stripped of title and standing. You will both present yourselves at the Dominion Council within 10 days to answer charges of corruption, false prosecution, and abuse of an unclaimed wolf." The hall erupted. Wolves were shouting, some in protest, some in something that sounded almost like relief, as if a pressure that had been building for years had finally been released. Sapphira could see faces she recognized: the kitchen wolves, the border sentries, the lower-ranked members who had lived under Direxia's thumb for as long as she had, and some of them were crying. Walden lunged to his feet. His face was twisted with fury, and for one terrible moment, Sapphira thought he was going to attack. He took 3 steps toward the platform, his body already beginning to shift, fur rippling across his shoulders, claws extending from his fingers. "She was mine," he snarled. "You can't just walk in here and—" Tarek didn't shift. He didn't need to. He simply turned his head and looked at Walden, and the full weight of an Alpha King's dominance hit the Beta Sun like a wall of stone. Walden's shift reversed so violently it looked painful, fur retracting, bones snapping back, his body folding in on itself until he was on his knees on the stone floor, gasping. "She was never yours." Tarek's voice was barely above a whisper. "And if you ever speak about her like she's something to be owned again, I will forget that I came here to uphold the law and remember that I am a wolf whose mate was put in chains." Walden didn't move. He stayed on his knees with his head bowed, trembling. Sapphira stood on the platform, watching the world she had known rearrange itself around a man she had fallen in love with at a river crossing. She was shaking, not from fear, from the sheer overwhelming velocity of everything happening at once. 6 weeks ago, she had been in Omega scrubbing clothes on rocks. Now she was standing in a hall full of wolves who were kneeling, and the most powerful alpha alive was looking at her like she was the only thing in the room that mattered. Tarek climbed the platform steps and stood before her. The hall was watching. Every wolf, every breath, every heartbeat in that room was tuned to this moment. "I should have told you the truth from the beginning," he said. "I was afraid. I've spent my entire life surrounded by people who want something from me. My power, my territory, my name. When I met you at the river, you didn't know any of that. You talked to me like I was just a man. You laughed at my bad jokes. You told me I had pine needles in my hair." A faint, almost broken smile crossed his face. "You were the first person in my life who ever saw me without the crown, and I couldn't bear to put it back on and watch you look at me differently." Sapphira reached up and touched his face. Her hand was still trembling, but her voice was steady. "I fell in love with the man at the river," she said. "I don't care about the crown, Tarek. I never would have." The mate bond pulsed between them. She could feel it physically now, a warmth that radiated from the center of her chest outward, spreading through her body like sunlight breaking through clouds. And she could see the answering glow in his eyes, amber brightening to gold, and she knew he felt it too. Tarek reached into the inner pocket of his coat and pulled out a ring. It was simple. A band of dark metal set with a single stone that burned like captured moonlight. It was not the kind of ring an Alpha King was expected to give. It was the kind of ring a man who had been visiting a river every afternoon for 6 weeks would choose. Personal, deliberate, intimate. "This was my mother's ring," he said. "She told me to give it to the woman who made me want to be more than what I was born to be." He held it between them. "Sapphira, I'm not asking you to be my Luna because I'm the Alpha King. I'm asking you to be my mate because standing next to you at that river was the only place in my life where I've ever felt like I was home." Sapphira let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. She couldn't speak. She just nodded, pressing her lips together to keep from completely falling apart in front of 300 wolves, and Tarek slid the ring onto her finger. The moment the metal touched her skin, the bond completed. It was visible. Every wolf in the hall saw it, a shimmer of light that ran along Sapphira's skin, tracing the lines of her veins like liquid silver, flowing up her arms and across her collarbone, settling into a mark at the base of her throat that pulsed with a soft, steady glow. The Luna mark. Not the ceremonial mark that could be bestowed by any alpha, the true mark, the one that appeared only when the moon herself acknowledged a bond as fated and eternal. Sapphira had never felt power before. She was an Omega. She was the lowest. She was nothing. But as the mark settled into her skin, she felt something vast and ancient open inside her, like a door she hadn't known existed. And what poured through it was not just power, but recognition. Her wolf, the wolf she had spent her entire life suppressing because Blackridge had taught her it was worthless, rose to the surface with a strength that made her gasp, and she realized with a shock that stole the air from her lungs that she was not an Omega. She had never been an Omega. Her wolf was silver, pure, luminous, shimmering silver, and the aura it carried was not the aura of a subordinate wolf. It was the aura of a true Luna, a wolf born to stand beside a king. Tarek's eyes widened. He felt it too, the surge of power that came through the bond, her wolf's true nature finally unshackled. And the expression on his face was not surprise, but wonder, as if he had known, as if some deep instinctive part of him had always known what she was, even when she didn't know it herself. "There you are," he whispered. The wolves of Blackridge stared. Some fell to their knees. Some wept. The wolves who had tormented Sapphira for years, the ones who had called her worthless, who had given her the worst chores and the smallest portions, who had looked through her as if she were made of glass. Those wolves couldn't meet her eyes. Dorexia stared at the glowing mark on Sapphira's throat, and for the first time in all the years Sapphira had known her, the Luna's composure shattered completely. Her face crumbled, not into anger, into terror, because she understood with perfect clarity what she had done. She had chained and humiliated the fated mate of the Alpha King. She had tried to cage a born Luna. And there was no performance, no fabricated story, no amount of silk-voiced manipulation that could undo that. "I didn't know," Dorexia breathed. "How could I have known? She was just an Omega. She had no power, no bloodline." "She was a person," Tarek said, and his voice was the flattest, most terrifying thing Sapphira had ever heard. That should have been enough. He turned to the 2 Dominion guards who had materialized in the doorway. They had been stationed outside the entire time, Sapphira realized, waiting for his signal. "Take Rendell and Dorexia into custody. Separate holdings. No communication with each other or with any member of this pack until the tribunal concludes." The guards moved with silent efficiency. Rendell went without resistance, his face hollow, his authority evaporated. But Dorexia fought. She twisted and pulled and begged, her perfect composure abandoned, her voice raw and jagged as she was escorted from the hall. "Sapphira! Sapphira, you have to tell them! I was good to you! I took you in! I gave you a home!" Her voice echoed off the stone walls as she was pulled through the doorway. "Please! You know I never meant! I never!" The doors closed behind her, and the echo died. Sapphira stood on the platform in a silent hall, and she felt something she had never allowed herself to feel in Blackridge. Safe. She looked down at the ring on her finger. She looked at the glowing mark on her skin. She looked at Tarek, who was watching her with an expression of such open, unguarded devotion that it made her chest ache in the best possible way. "What happens now?" she asked. Tarek took her hand. His thumb traced a slow circle over her knuckles, and the mate bond hummed between them like a living thing. "Now I take you home," he said simply. "If you'll let me." Home. Sapphira had never had one. She had lived in Blackridge her entire life, but it had never been home. It had been a place to survive, a place to endure, a place where she made herself small enough to avoid being noticed because being noticed meant being hurt. She looked out at the hall. Wolves were watching her with wide eyes, some fearful, some ashamed, some hopeful. These were the people who had ignored her pain, who had let Dorexia's cruelty go unchallenged because challenging it was inconvenient. She wanted to hate them. Part of her tried. But Sapphira had spent her whole life being the kind of person people discarded, and she understood, with a bone-deep clarity that came from years of being the one no one stood up for, that most of them hadn't been cruel. They had been afraid. Dorexia had built a system that punished anyone who stepped out of line, and these wolves had done what frightened people do. They had looked the other way. It didn't make it right, but it made it understandable. "I'm not going to tell you I forgive all of you," she said, and her voice carried across the hall with a steadiness that surprised even her. "Some of you watched me suffer and said nothing. Some of you whispered about me behind my back. Some of you laughed when Dorexia made me serve at her table with bruises on my arms and no explanation." She paused. "I see you. I remember. And I will carry that with me." The silence was suffocating. "But I also know what it's like to live under someone's control," she continued. "I know what it costs to speak up when speaking up means losing everything. So I'm not going to punish you for being human." She straightened her spine, and the Luna mark at her throat pulsed brighter. "What I am going to do is make sure that no wolf in this pack, or any pack under the Dominion, ever has to choose between their safety and their conscience again." Tarek squeezed her hand. When she looked at him, his eyes were shining. "That," he said quietly, "is why the moon chose you." They left Blackridge together. Tarek's convoy was waiting beyond the tree line. Sleek black vehicles and Dominion wolves in formal attire, a king's retinue that looked absurdly out of place on the dirt road that led out of the territory. Sapphira climbed into the lead vehicle and looked back once, just once, at the pack house silhouette against the darkening sky. She thought she would feel grief. Blackridge was the only world she had ever known. She felt nothing. Just the warmth of Tarek's hand in hers, and the steady golden pulse of the mate bond that connected them like a bridge between two shores. And she realized that she had never belonged there. She had been waiting. Not passively, not weakly. She had been surviving, day after day, with a quiet, relentless stubbornness that had kept her intact through things that would have broken wolves twice her size. And now, the waiting was over. They arrived at the Dominion seat 3 hours later. Sapphira had expected something cold, a fortress, a palace of stone and silence. What she found was a sprawling estate built into the side of a mountain, with warm light pouring from every window and gardens that terraced down the slope in cascading waves of green. Wolves came out to meet them, and when Tarek introduced her, they didn't bow to her rank. They bowed to her. Some of them touched their throats, acknowledging the Luna mark. A few of the older wolves had tears in their eyes. "They've been waiting," Tarek told her as they walked through the main hall. "I've been Alpha King for 8 years. They'd given up on me finding a mate." "Why did it take so long?" she asked. Tarek stopped walking. He turned to face her, and in the lamplight she could see the exhaustion beneath the power, the loneliness that lived in the spaces between his authority and his solitude. "Because I was looking for someone who could stand beside me," he said, "not behind me. Do you know how rare that is? Most wolves see the crown, and they forget there's a man underneath it. They want the power, or the protection, or the prestige." His hand found her face, cradling her jaw. "You didn't want any of that. You wanted to talk to a man in a worn coat about what the sunset looked like. You wanted to know why I always smiled when the wind changed direction." His voice cracked, just barely. "I would have burned the entire world down before I let them take you from me." Sapphira kissed him. It wasn't a polite kiss. It wasn't careful or hesitant. It was a kiss that contained 6 weeks of stolen afternoons, the terror of chains, the relief of rescue, and the wild, consuming certainty that this man, this impossible, gentle, terrifying, beautiful man, was hers. The mate bond exploded between them, light pouring through every point of contact, and when they finally separated, both of them breathless, Sapphira could see the silver glow of her lunamark reflected in his eyes. Weeks passed. Sapphira settled into the Dominion like a key sliding into a lock, natural, inevitable, as if the space had always been shaped for her. She sat with Tarek in council meetings. She reviewed territory disputes. She established a new protocol for the treatment of packless and unclaimed wolves, a system of sanctuary and rehabilitation that would ensure no Omega ever stood in chains at a fabricated tribunal again. The wolves of the Dominion didn't just accept her, they loved her. Because Sapphira led the way she had lived, with her eyes open, her heart exposed, her hands extended even to wolves who hadn't earned it yet. She wasn't soft. She was steel, wrapped in compassion. And every wolf who met her understood, within minutes, why the moon had chosen her for the most powerful alpha alive. The Dominion Tribunal for Rendell and Direxia was held 6 weeks after the night in Blackridge. Sapphira sat beside Tarek on the council dais, the lunamark steady at her throat, and she watched as the evidence was laid out. Years of corruption, dozens of wolves abused under Direxia's regime, financial improprieties that Rendell had either orchestrated or willfully ignored. Rendell was stripped of his alpha status and reassigned to a supervised holding territory in the far north. He accepted the judgment with the defeated silence of a man who had known, long before the tribunal, that his authority had been borrowed, not earned. Direxia's judgment was harsher. She was permanently exiled from the Dominion, not to another pack, from pack life entirely. She would spend the rest of her years as a lone wolf, without territory, without rank, without the social structure she had spent her life manipulating to her advantage. For a wolf like Direxia, who had defined herself entirely by her power over others, it was a fate worse than any physical punishment. When the judgment was read, Direxia looked directly at Sapphira. There was no begging this time. No performance, just a look that held the full, unvarnished weight of a woman realizing that the Omega she had tried to crush had become the one to deliver her sentence. Sapphira held her gaze. She didn't flinch. She didn't gloat. She simply looked at the woman who had made her life a daily exercise in survival, and she let the silence speak for itself. Some punishments don't require words. That night, Tarek found Sapphira on the terrace overlooking the mountain gardens. The moon was full, silver light pouring down like water, and Sapphira's lunamark was glowing so brightly it cast soft shadows around her feet. He stood beside her and said nothing for a long time. They didn't need words. The bond between them was a language unto itself. Warmth for comfort, a pulse of gold for joy, a deep, resonant hum for the kind of love that doesn't shout because it doesn't need to. She looked at me today, Sapphira finally said. Direxia. Right when they read the judgment. And you know what I felt? Tell me. Nothing. She turned to face him. No satisfaction, no revenge, no anger, just nothing. She has no power over me anymore. She hasn't had power over me since the night you walked into that hall. Tarek pulled her close. She pressed her face into his chest and listened to his heartbeat, steady, strong, perfectly synchronized with hers through the bond. You know what I thought the first time I saw you at the river? He murmured against her hair. That I had terrible laundry technique? He laughed, a real laugh, the kind that shook his chest and made the bond spark with warmth. I thought, there she is. His arms tightened around her. The woman I've been waiting for my entire life. Standing in a river, scrubbing shirts on rocks, singing a song she thought no one could hear. He tilted her face up to his. I loved you before I knew your name, Sapphira, and I will love you long after the mountains come down and the rivers dry up and the moon herself goes dark. Sapphira smiled. It was the kind of smile that came from a place so deep inside her that she hadn't even known it existed until he found it. Take me home, Tarek. You are home. And she was. For the first time in her life, Sapphira was exactly where she belonged. Not because someone had placed her there, not because she had been claimed or collected or controlled, but because she had chosen. She had chosen the man at the river. She had chosen love over safety, truth over security, and the unknown over the familiar. And the unknown had chosen her back. The moon hung high and silver above the mountain, and beneath it, in the warm light of a home she had never dared to dream she deserved, the Alpha King held his Luna, and the bond between them burned like a second sun, fierce, unbreakable, eternal. They had shamed her for choosing the poor stranger, and the poor stranger turned out to be everything. Did you like the story? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to tell us what country, state, or city you're watching from. You might hear your name in our next shout-out. Special shout-out to our incredible viewers from Kansas, USA, Chicago, Illinois, Greensboro, North Carolina, Ithaca, New York, Bethany, Oklahoma, Lakewood, Washington, USA, Perth, Western Australia, Amsterdam, Holland, Rockford, Illinois, Florissant, Missouri, Cape Town, South Africa, Maryland, Scotland, and so many more around the world. Your support truly means everything. Click the videos on your screen to dive into more of our stories. Subscribe now and stay with us for the next story. You won't want to miss it. Thank you for watching.